Thank you, everyone. Welcome, and I really appreciate you coming out tonight and sharing this evening with us. You know, it's been a really eventful year. Some of you who've been around the center have seen some of the changes. You know, we started the year with the successful completion of the Solid campaign that some of you are a part of, people who are making long-term commitments to support the center, the same kind of long-term commitments that we're trying to make to the community here. And that allowed us to do some amazing things. It allowed us to expand the hours of our summer program. It allowed us to double the size of the Buffett Scholars Program. And it laid the groundwork for expanding our programs to be able to serve our new neighbors who are living in the Tree Lane family apartments. We've just recently made the biggest expansion of our elementary program in 10 years, starting a whole new classroom up at John Muir, going from about 35 kids in our elementary program to 60. It's still all a work in progress, and staff have been working incredibly hard. So I'd actually like to take a minute to recognize some of the staff who are here who have just been really pedal to the floor for a full year. So, you know, this evening is about our 40th anniversary, and as I was thinking about thanking staff, there's one staff person who hasn't been here for more than 10 years, but who's been here for 7, who's going to be leaving us in a little while. Susan Ramsbacher, our assistant director. I don't think I know anybody who has worked harder in the last 7 years than Susan, and so I just want to take a minute. If you'll stand up, Susan, just take a round of applause. So, you know, we're celebrating 40 years, and it's important to me that we keep telling the stories from the early years of the center. They inform us in how we should continue today. And that founding story that I often tell, some of you have heard me tell before, is actually the story that Opal's mom was involved in, Dolores Tomaszewska. When I started, actually, when I was hired, she was the vice president of the board, and when she gave me a tour of the center on my first day, those 2 apartments over at Wexford Ridge, we got to the end of the tour, and she said, "So, Paul, this isn't the center. The center's the place you're going to get built." Right? And I was 30, and I'd never been director of anything, and I believed her, right? But Dolores also, in that first year, she took me, or we went together to a United Way rally at Rayovac. I remember because, you know, she got up and told her story, and it went something like this. She said, I moved to the Wexford Ridge Apartments from a small town in rural Wisconsin. She said that she was fleeing a relatively brutal relationship, and so she had done what women are taught to do in those situations, and she'd made a plan, and she'd gathered her what she needed and her kids, what she could carry, and gotten away, and had this apartment in Wexford Ridge that she moved into. And on the first night, she was living on the first floor, and the sliding glass door didn't lock. So first night in the big city and can't even lock the door to your apartment. And it got to be kind of close to dinner time, and there was a knock at the door. And she said that she froze because no one was supposed to know where she was. She hadn't even told her family. So she opened the door, and on the other side was a woman, her neighbor, a woman named Precious McCain. Precious' daughter Diana is with us here today. And Precious said, "I saw you just moved in, and I wanted to invite you over for dinner." And Dolores said at this point, she kind of looked behind herself at this empty apartment, and she said, "I'm sorry, I wouldn't be able to do that, because I wouldn't be able to invite you back." And she said at that point, Precious grew about 3 inches, and she said, "I did not invite you over to my house so that you could invite me back. Grab your kids and come over, you're going to have some dinner." Which she did. That night there was a tenants association meeting. In the early years there was the Wexford Ridge Association for Tenants and Housing, which spells wrath. Great 70s tenant organizing name. And so Dolores went with Precious. Precious was involved. Dolores went there and participated in the meeting. Dolores is an avid reader and writer, so she ended up taking the notes for the meeting. And then at the end of the meeting, Precious stood up and said, well, you know Dolores is new. This is her first day in the apartment. What you may not know is that she and her family moved here with basically what they can carry. They don't have any furniture, they don't have any plates, pots, all that kind of stuff. And so people started saying, well, I've got 4 plates that you can, I've got this, I've got that kind of thing. And Dolores, at this point, when she was telling the story, she said, and then one woman said, you can take my frying pan. And she stopped, she said, not my extra frying pan, right? When Dolores told us it wasn't her extra frying pan, it was her frying pan. And the next morning, they all got together and they started calling local churches and local organizations and saying, we got a family here, the kids need a bed, and they all worked together and kind of got her set up, which would be a great story in and of itself, right? Let alone, 20 years later, actually a little bit more than 20 years later, and she's the vice president of the board, and she's the person who founded the Food from Friends program that still goes on every Friday here, the Fresh Produce and Breads Gleaners program, that, all of the things that she did. But one of the things that she and that group did a couple of years later was they were having some issues with the landlord at the time. Any of you there were some folks here from the city know some of the stories of the building inspectors from those years, and the landlord wouldn't meet with them. And so they were doing some research. They had some support from a young organizer from the Community Action Coalition named Billy Feitlinger. Some of you may have heard of him. And a community organizer named Verna Hill, who's no longer with us. And this group did some research, and they figured out that the landlord needed a signature from the city of Madison in order to pull down the federal HUD subsidies, those Section 8 subsidies. And so they went to the director of the housing department, a guy named Saul Levin, and they went to the mayor, this guy named Paul Soglin. And they said, please don't give him his signature until he meets with us. And they agreed. So they got their meeting. They had 6 demands. I know what 3 of them were. One of them was about weatherization, which is still an issue in those apartments. One of them was about getting a playground. There are 250 families and no playgrounds. And one of them was about getting a space to do some community programming. Well, I know they won on the last 2. They got permission to build a playground. They got playground equipment donated. They bought the CC Rider Motorcycle Club a keg of beer to put it all in, right? Slightly less litigious times than today. And they got access to one of the townhouses to use for programs. And for the first probably 15 years, this group of mostly women from the neighborhood ran the center. They had friends and partners from local churches and local organizations, but they ran it themselves with no staff. Slowly in the 90s, they were able to get a little bit of funding, get a part-time staff person, get a full-time director, and slowly build. But that history is what we build on. And that history of, it's a truly important story for me that we tell again and again. Because in Madison, we have this really bad habit. I'm going to say we. Some of us who look like me, some of us who have privilege, have this really bad habit of telling a story about low-income people that is all about needs, right? And is all about problems. But this center is a gift. The foundation of this center was built on the work of a group of mostly low-income women for over 15 years and all of the years since. And so that's one of the stories that we need to continually tell. And we need to continually honor and live up to. That is why this center will never be a social service agency. That is why this center will never have any clients or any customers, because everybody who walks through the doors of this center has something to offer, and everyone has needs to be met. I wanted to tell that story today for the 40th anniversary. You also notice that I didn't want to just tell those stories, because there's not just one story. Right? There's not just Dolores' story or Precious's story. There's a whole bunch of stories. You see all of the stories in this room in those ribbons that people have on their name tags, right? If you think about all the ribbons that you see, those are all folks who've been around and involved in the center in some way for more than 10 years, right? So we wanted to actually take a minute tonight and allow you to turn to somebody you don't know, possibly someone who has a ribbon on, possibly someone who doesn't, and just share a story that is one of your first memories or one of your fondest memories of the early years of the center. It might require you to stand up, and it might be hard for us to get you back once you start talking to each other, but we're going to try. Right? So I'd actually like, this is the first time we've done this, a little bit of an experiment, but I'd like you actually to do that. Turn to somebody and just share, someone you don't know, and just share some story or experience. We'll take about 5 minutes. All right. So it's always dangerous to start you talking because we might not be able to bring you back. I did. So if you can start to wrap up your stories. The good news, the really good news, is that if you didn't have enough time to share your stories, and if you met somebody who you'd like to know more about, the story sharing doesn't have to stop here. We know that the way that we actually build community is sharing our stories, right? The way that we come to really know each other is by sharing our stories. When you start to understand the whys in people's lives, you really start to understand each other. And that's what builds power in this community. So this was a little taste, and it's always hard to bring people back because you could feel the energy in the room pop as soon as those stories started being shared. Continue that, right? When you're here in this building, whether it's tonight or it's 2 weeks from now, and you see somebody who you don't know, this is the kind of place where you can come up and just say, hey, oh, how did you get involved here? Oh, interesting. Have you been involved a long time? What do you do here, right? That's a part of what we're doing when we're building community. I think it's also important to recognize that there are a large number of the people who helped to make this center possible who are no longer with us. Precious McCain being one of them. There are a number of names, people that I didn't get to meet, but whose names I've heard. Mary Lavender is one of them. There are a number of folks. And I also just want to acknowledge that in this community where we have the disparities that we do, those losses have not fallen equally. We have lost more of our African American elders and leaders earlier, sooner. In preparing for tonight, it became painfully obvious to me. When I thought about the people who would have the red 1970s ribbons on, and how many I was like, oh, yes, but we lost them. That's a legacy of the racism that exists in our community, and we have to name it and we have to own it. I want to tell one of the stories of someone who is no longer here, and her name was Jerry English. How many people remember Jerry English? Right? So I met Geraldine English my first day working at the center. Jerry worked in the schools during the school year, and during the summer she worked in our summer camp. And when I met her, she was Aunt Jerry to all the kids in the neighborhood. She was also magic. She was the only one who could magically tell if the kids had washed their hands or not before. After a couple of weeks, once I'd earned her trust, she told me the trick, which is that kids never dry their wrists. She also told me her story. Jerry said that I believe it was in the 1980s, she moved into Wexford Ridge. She was young. She was seriously suffering from depression. And she was in her house most of the time. She wasn't working. And every once in a while, probably about once a month, someone from the center would come and knock on her door. Oh, by the way, we're doing this thing down at the center. And she'd look at them, shut the door. And a month later, someone would come by and say, hey, by the way, there's this thing going on at the center. You want to come down? And she'd look at them and shut the door. 6, 7, 8, 9 months later, they caught her on a good day. She opened the door. She's like, all right, I'll come down. That was 15 years before I met her. By the time I met her, she was Aunt Jerry. She was a neighborhood institution. She was a fixture in the lives of so many children. She said, Paul, I want you to remember that. I want you, don't ever give up on anybody in this community. That stuck with me. It's something that I think about probably once a month, right? Right? There's always a story. There's always someone who's coming and we're talking and, oh, we're so frustrated because this person has so much potential, but they won't, or I won't even show you, right? And it's the Aunt Jerry story that comes to me. So I just want to say that I think in this time, that is the commitment that we're making to each other. We're not going to give up on each other. We're not going to allow our views of each other to be limited or simplified by some immediate impression. We're going to hold tight to the knowledge that you, whoever you are that I'm talking to, are capable of things that you have not yet even imagined. And if you are, then so am I. And together, building relationships like we were just now, that simple storytelling around our most deeply held values, pooling our time and our energy and our resources in the service of our common good, we are incredibly powerful. I look forward to seeing what we do with that power together over the coming days and the coming years. Thank you for all that you do.